Is anger useful to us in an early Buddhist understanding? Recently I had a discussion with a couple of friends of mine who were very accomplished meditation teachers, and they were making the point that perhaps in early Buddhism, or for the Buddha, anger was something different from hatred. That is, that there's no question that the Buddha was opposed to hatred. Hatred is a mental state that is involved in our desire to harm someone else because of our ill will or dislike towards them. But perhaps there's room in Buddhism, perhaps the Buddha made room for a somewhat milder state, the state of anger that might be helpful. So that's going to be the topic of today's video. Is anger useful to us? What I'm going to do first is to give some potential arguments from the early suttas that seem to suggest that perhaps anger is useful. Then I'll look for some other evidence that shows that anger is perhaps not useful. And at the end, I'll try to bring everything together. So to begin with, why might we think that anger is useful for the Buddha? Well, when we look at the early suttas, it certainly looks as though the Buddha gets angry. In particular, he seems to get angry with wayward monks who misinterpret the Dharma and seem to claim things that the Buddha didn't say, claim that the Buddha said things that he did not say. One famous example of this involves Sāti, the fisherman's son, who claims that consciousness is something that persists through time and persists from life to life. So when the Buddha is confronted with Sāti and with what Sāti is saying, this is what we read in the suttas. The Buddha confronts Sāti and says, "Foolish man, who on earth have you ever known me to teach in that way? Haven't I said in many ways that consciousness is dependently originated, since consciousness does not arise without a cause? But still you misrepresent me by your wrong grasp. Harm yourself and create much wickedness. This will be for your lasting harm and suffering." Then the Buddha said to the mendicants, "What do you think, mendicants? Has this mendicant Sāti kindled even a spark of ardor in this teaching and training?" "How could that be, sir? No, sir." When this was said, Sāti sat silent, dismayed, shoulders drooping, downcast, depressed, with nothing to say. Knowing this, the Buddha said, "Foolish man, you will be known by your own harmful misconception." Now, how should we describe this exchange between the Buddha and Sāti? It certainly looks as though the Buddha is angry, and this is not the only time that the Buddha reacts in this way to one of his monastics. He does this several times. Now, we know from a separate early text that the Buddha says explicitly that he is not opposed to speech that is unpleasant, to speech that is disliked by people. He says that sometimes unpleasant speech is worth saying if it is done at the right time and if it is true and useful, basically. He likens this case to the case of a father who sees his son putting a stick or stone in his mouth. The father might attempt to get the stick or stone out of the boy's mouth, even if it drew blood in doing that. In other words, the father might have to do something quite extreme in order to get that stick or stone out of the boy's mouth. This is done, of course, out of love, out of compassion for the child, even though it might hurt in the short term. Of course, we might think of more modern examples of surgery that are done in order to save somebody's life. So clearly the Buddha is not opposed to unpleasant speech in principle. But this example with Sāti seems to go a little beyond being merely unpleasant speech. So we have to consider the possibility that maybe he's angry and making use of that anger. My friend, this meditation teacher, brings up also the example of Māra. Māra the tempter, this kind of evil sort of deity within Buddhism who is the embodiment of the hindrances in particular. These hindrances that draw us away from our search towards enlightenment. Now, the Buddha himself claimed to be visited by Māra even after he became enlightened. And this raises the possibility or at least raises the question about the Buddha's own relationship to these hindrances, in particular in what we're discussing now, the hindrance of ill will, which is a kind of embodiment of anger, the Buddha's relationship to ill will after his enlightenment. Now, it certainly is the case that since the Buddha is enlightened, he's not going to be in the grasp of anger. He's not going to be pulled this way and that by anger. But at least the fact that the Buddha claims to be visited by Māra raises the possibility that he is essentially visited by a kind of a ghost of anger, we might say, a kind of an apparition of ill will that sort of arises from time to time, and that perhaps when the Buddha sees this kind of apparition of anger, even though he isn't in its grasp ever, he might perhaps see it arising and say, well, I can make use of that. Or alternately, and this I believe is the more traditional reading of these encounters between the Buddha and wayward monastics, alternately, anger never enters into it. The Buddha never gets angry. It simply appears to us that he's angry because of our ignorance. Now, this, as I say, is sort of the traditional understanding of these examples, but there is at least one potential problem with that interpretation, which is that the Buddha in other suttas says that in order for us to accept a teacher as our teacher, we have to go through a process of vetting them, of essentially putting them through scrutiny, an investigation. And one of the things that investigation is supposed to establish for us is that our potential teacher does not display any overt examples of what we might term defiled states. In other words, when we're vetting our teacher, one of the things we're looking for is, do they seem to display anger, among other things? Anger, greed, other kinds of states. And again, it certainly seems in these examples as though the Buddha is angry. Now, it may have been that at the time, the Buddha didn't seem angry to the people around him. Perhaps he was saying what he was saying with a kind of a benign smile, and it would not have been experienced as anger by his audience. Or again, perhaps there's a distinction to be made between anger and hatred, where anger is not a defiled or a difficult or problematic state, and hatred is. And so when we vet our teachers, it's perfectly fine for them to display anger, but not fine for them to display hatred. I'm simply trying to go through all of the possible options here. But now let's turn to our second point, which is the point that, in fact, if we want to interpret the suttas this way, as showing the Buddha being angry but not hate-filled, the problem is that the suttas pretty much exclusively describe anger as an unfortunate or defiled mental state. There's even an entire chapter on the Dhammapada on anger in which it is described in these kinds of negative terms. So, for example, in the suttas we read, "These two things lead to the decline of a mendicant trainee. What two? Anger and resentment. And, mendicants, these four things oppose the true teaching. What for? Valuing anger, denigration, material possessions, and honor rather than the true teaching. A mendicant who values anger and denigration, possessions and honor, doesn't grow in the true teaching like a rotten seed in a good field." So then, is it case closed? Have we decided then that if we read the suttas, we're pretty clear that anger is a defiled mental state and we should never seek it out? Well, perhaps not. There's one particular stanza in the Dhammapada that seems at least to allow for an alternate interpretation. In the Dhammapada, one of these verses we read, "When anger surges like a lurching chariot, keep it in check. That's what I call a charioteer. Others just hold the reins." This verse seems to claim that anger has its uses. That anger, yes, it's like a lurching chariot, but if you can hold the reins and control that anger, you can make use of it. Then potentially Anger is a useful state of mind in certain circumstances. This at least seems to imply that perhaps the enlightened person is the true charioteer, who can hold the reins of his or her anger and make use of it and direct the horses of that anger in the right direction, whereas the rest of us unenlightened people are simply holding the reins and allowing the anger to carry us willy-nilly wherever it goes, and of course, as a result, creating harm with it. Indeed, there is some recent psychological work, which I'll leave a link to down below in the notes, that suggests that anger may be a beneficial psychological state under certain circumstances, and one that we may be able to make use of in this way. However, there's a separate interpretation of this particular stanza that I've read from the Dhammapada, which is that it's not talking about an enlightened person at all, but rather about an unenlightened person who is well-trained, who is farther along in the training. For example, it may be that what the Buddha is saying here is that the trainee, the good trainee, is one who can maneuver anger properly. The average human is one who is carried by it. The trainee is one who can handle the reins properly, but the enlightened person is one for whom anger never arises in the first place. Well, how might we try to solve this kind of conundrum of these different ways of interpreting this stanza? Well, we can look at the next stanza in the Dhammapada after this one. What does it say about anger, if anything? Again, this is in the chapter on anger. So what the next verse says is, "Defeat anger with kindness, villainy with virtue, stinginess with giving, and lies with truth." So here we see that anger is analogized with villainy, with stinginess, and with lies, which clearly are not positive sorts of mental states or positive sorts of actions. So where does this leave us? How can we bring all of this together, all of this material that I've discussed in this video so far? Well, it seems clear from the early suttas that anger is described as a defiled state in early Buddhism. It's never explicitly recommended in the early texts. Nevertheless, I think we're left with the fact that it seems as though the Buddha gets angry in certain of the suttas. I think it's a completely natural reading of those suttas that the Buddha seems angry, even though perhaps he is not. So we're left a little bit with a conundrum here. And what do you think? What is your impression of all of this material? What is your impression of anger as understood as different from hatred in early Buddhism? If you want more examples from the suttas about anger in particular and its potential distinction from hatred, I did a prior video on this question as well, where I talk about different examples, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. However, if you want to know how to deal with anger, which I think is a more pressing concern for most of us, I have an earlier video on that topic as well. I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen, so you can click on it and see it next if you'd like. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.